Hello, my beautiful motorheads. Welcome to Feroce, where we inspire you to live fiercely. I'm your host, Anik Magak. Today's guest is Jamie Waters. He's an avid collector of both motorcycles and cars, and he's been collecting since he was a child. We talk about his collection, or as he may say, his accumulation and hoarding. And we also talk about what it's like to race vintage motorcycles and invest in motorsports. Jamie, usually I ask this question much further along in the interview, but we have to start with it. So, how many motorcycles and cars do you own?
That's a loaded question on in many ways. Too many is the answer. I don't know. It's something I lost count a long time ago, particularly with the motorcycles. But between cars and bikes, it's maybe 150 to 175 or something like that. And I'm not proud of this. I'm not proud of this. My kids aren't proud of me for this. I'm not proud of myself for the quantum of stuff that's accumulated over the years, but there you have it, the dirty truth.
So is one of the big things with a collection of this size being able to find places to store them?
I think at one point in time, I was spread across maybe 7 or 8 facilities, which you can imagine, just the basic, plant that's required to maintain that many facilities. It was kind of ridiculous. I have tried, like any, bad hoarder or good collector, to thin the herd, so to speak, at times. But, like a gremlin, you kill one and two take its place. So, it's easier said than done. Some of them you form attachments based on the thinnest of relationships, either with the bike or the car or whatever. You're like, well, I remember a drive I did once, and it was a great day and I had a good time. I can't sell that. I can't sell this. You invent all kind of ridiculous excuses, as to why you can't thin the herd. But we'll all be there someday.
Yeah.
Now I'm still trying to thin the herd. It feels good to sell. It feels better to sell as I get older, than it did when I was younger. You just pile on stuff willy nilly. But now, the marginal cost of adding something in terms of time and energy just becomes a lot harder to justify.
So where did this all start?
It started very young. My dad was into cars. He always
Mm-hmm.
talked about getting a motorcycle, but he never did. My parents were divorced, but my mom rode, of all things. And, she had a Harley V twin, fairly consistently. I think she would still ride today if she wasn't, afraid of who she might run into on the road.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember October 22nd of 1982. I was my dad had me Wednesdays and weekends, and I was at after school care. And he would normally pick me up on Fridays in he had a silver Z28 Camaro with a red interior. And instead, this guy pulls up in a beige on beige 1976 Corvette. And I'm like, wow, who is that? That guy is the cat's ass. I mean, I was like, who is this guy? I wonder whose dad this is. And it was my dad. He gets out, he's wearing like a pink polo shirt, some khakis. It was 1982. I think Reagan had been the assassination attempt. But anyway, I digress. So that Friday was really, and I remember getting in the car, and he had brought a pillow. So I was 7 years old at the time. And, so I could see over the dash, and, that really set the hook. I mean, I just thought, like, this thing exists only to have fun in. Like, this
Mm-hmm.
thing does nothing else. You can't really carry much in it. It's only two people. It's fairly tight. Even at that age, it seemed like a very small cabin. And so that was really the start of it. And my dad would be the first person to tell you I've gone completely crazy with it relative to, where he is. Like, I think it's overwhelming to him sometimes. And it was
Mm-hmm.
overwhelming to him even when I was a child, because I was just crazy about anything automotive or mechanical. But, at the same time, he fostered it. He got me a go-kart when I was 4, B&G Flyer, 1979, for Christmas. And I drove that like a car. He lived in a fairly rural area, so the dirt roads, nothing off limits. This is back when free range meant something.
Hmm.
as far as bringing kids up. And I put thousands of miles in that go-kart. And then in 1984, he got me for Christmas, he got me a Honda 125 three-wheeler, thinking that the three-wheeler was safer than a motorcycle,
Oh my
which
God.
is what had really wanted. And I think within a couple of years, three-wheelers were banned, from being sold new in the U.S. anyway. But I still have his Corvette. I still have that three-wheeler. I still have that go-kart. So, in other words, I'm living in a man-made prison of artifacts from my youth, from my dad's youth for that matter. So, but one of the things my dad always would say to me, he'd say, just buy the best that you can afford,
Hmm.
and it's better to do without than to do with something that's not the best. And there's a great quote in a somewhat obscure movie from the 70s called The Last American Hero. And it is Jeff Bridges and Gary Busey and their brothers. It's based on a Tom Wolfe sort of series of articles about Junior Johnson, the famous NASCAR racer. And the old grizzled, the patriarch of the family, and he's been busted for moonshining. This is like Dukes of Hazzard before Dukes of
Yeah.
Hazzard. And the Uncle Jesse type character, the sons come to visit him in prison, and they're looking after their ma, and they're making money as best they can. The Jeff Bridges character wants to become a NASCAR racer, but they're trying to keep the family, the moonshine business going. And he's like, Dad, I found a great new way to deliver. I've repurposed a gasoline truck, and we filled it with moonshine, and that's how we're doing much much more volume. And he says nothing good ever came out of a truck or something like that. And then he looks at him and he says, "Son, there's only two kinds of everything: the best and the rest." And just like I'm just like, oh my God, that's like the greatest thing I've ever heard. The best and the rest. And it's so true. Um, and it is that sort of, I think, goes into collecting and all kinds of things.
There's a lot there because being able to have a parent that supports your interests is number one, amazing. And then two, that obviously it fostered a lifelong interest, which has developed. So at this point, does he live vicariously through you and your collection?
He does. It's a lot cheaper to do it that way for him. Um, he has certain favorites, that he's really gravitated to over the years. But he absolutely lives vicariously through the stuff I do. And if it's doable, he's retired now. I'll take him with me on trips. We went to Amelia Island together earlier this year, and that was a real highlight for him and for me. And so I try to involve him. But my kids, I'm still holding out hope. They're 13, 10, and 8. And so far they don't really have the gene. They look at me
Oh,
like I've got two heads. They don't understand, why Papa, spends time on this stuff. They hate going to the garage. So hopefully like I said, I'm still holding out hope. I think my son, the 8-year-old, it may develop, it may manifest at some point in him, but so far I'm usually by myself in the garage.
okay. Which might also be a place of solace.
It is a fortress of solitude in a lot of ways. It's quiet,
Yeah.
so
Obviously you've had these bikes since your childhood and vehicles. How has your acquiring changed over the years?
when I started, I didn't really set out to be a collector. I kind of set out to be a user. I wanted to experience these things, so it's at various points in time, I had a list of things I wanted to find the right example of this car or that bike. And then, over time, things followed me home. There were a lot of mercy killings along the way of once people find out you're sick, they want to give you more drugs, right? Once they find out you're an addict, they bring you the whole suite of ways you can further do harm to yourself and everyone around you. So a lot of stuff came that way. Today, so it was really about sort of expanding the quantity of things. Well, if finding one example of something and then wanting to find another example of it and kind of going that way. Now it's more about finding better examples of stuff that,
Mm.
I used to be fairly indiscriminate about, accumulating. Um, and really, as in the early days, it was about collecting the things. Now it's more about trying to collect experiences with those vehicles and use them more. That's really the focus these days. Do I really need this car or that bike? I was reading a book about a collector a few years ago, and I think his collection was in Chicago, and he lived in New York, and he had a rule that if he didn't drive a car within 2 years, he'd sell it. And I thought that's a
Hmm.
pretty good rule. And he said on a few occasions he would make a special trip, you know, to make sure he drove the car within the 2 year limit. So I'm not quite there yet, but certainly I look at things very differently than I did when I was young. If something came along that I was interested in 20 years ago, I would do anything to make it happen within reason. It was less about the money versus the value of what I perceived it, to be, bringing to the collection. Today, I'm much more philosophical about it. If it's meant to be, it's meant to be. I'm a lot more pragmatic about price, and it generally, I don't know if we're living in a matrix or what you would call it, but generally speaking, more these days, the right vehicle finds me, or it leaves the collection and finds the right owner. And that brings me more joy than it would have 20 years ago. I would have, the idea of selling something was completely foreign to me. And now the idea of selling to the right person is a good thing.
Now, do people still seek you out and say, I have this for sale, or?
They do. For example, if there's one for sale, people know I'm very into that particular model of Norton, 1970 and 1971, and I just think they're fascinating bikes. I never bought them because I thought I would make money on them, and I probably haven't made money on them. But I still think they are just the most dynamite looking and performing bike of that era. And I've got 9 of these things in various stages or various provenance, various stages of condition when the factories were making homologation specials to get their racing parts onto their formula and production class race bikes. They made 119 of them over a 2 year period.
Now, you also race. Did you race that particular bike?
I built the first bike I built from the ground up was a Norton production racer, a genuine bike. I used a different engine, different transmission, different bodywork. I basically used the frame and the rear wheel from the original bike. I kept
That
everything
doesn't
else,
sound like
but
it was to production, but you.
no, it really became grandpa's axe, at the end of the day. I just built a very robust bike, very comfortable for me to ride. I built it as a Bears and Formula 750 bike to race with Arma. I raced that bike for 2 or 3 years. I never did a full season, but the fullest season I did, Arma counts, I think it's 10 or 11 out of the 20 or 22 rounds. The best 10 or 11 go into your score. The best I ever did, maybe '07. Kenny and I did a lot of events together, Kenny Cummings, NYC Norton. And he won the Bears championship, and I came in second. And that's the peak. And I was happy to be second. I don't, it doesn't, my perspective on racing was always, Kenny is a good counterpoint because I think my image is when Kenny's racing, he's grinning from ear to ear in the helmet, where I'm like not having fun when I'm on the track. My fun is going to the track and leaving the track in one piece, myself, the bike, the equipment, everything. And which I love. It's a great feeling to leave the track successfully, but it was never really my bailiwick. And all I ever wanted, I didn't care what place I was on the track. I just wanted to be able to dice with someone. Arma is a great place to do that. I learned a lot about bike construction and preparation from that experience. And I haven't raced in a couple of years. My last event was Roebling on a McIntyre Matchless G50. That was 2 or 3 years ago, post COVID, but it wasn't 2 years. So yeah, 2 or 3 years ago.
And we never did do sidecar.
Not yet. I haven't ridden that. I basically restored that rig.
Yeah.
Um, you will be the first person I call once I get it going. So
Excellent. I'm ready to monkey. I'm ready to put my life into your hands.
I'm not sure that I'm ready to put my own life in my hands, but thank you anyway. Uh,
So do you think that you'll continue to race or
I might race again. Um, I don't feel like I don't wake up in the middle of the night thinking I got to be at the racetrack.
Mhm.
I like going to races. There have been probably a half a dozen fatalities at the vintage races, just the hundred or so, that I've participated in over the years.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, it is dangerous. I would
Mhm.
feel, I would feel very stupid to hurt myself doing something that is not my profession. It's an aggressive hobby. For
Mhm.
me, it's not my passion. The racing for me really came out of the need to be able to exercise a lot of the vintage racing bikes in a relatively controlled environment. I don't really have the ego. I don't have to stand on a podium or get a Arma isn't I would say Arma's probably not known for their trophies. So it was really about having fun with my friends, like
Mhm.
Kenny and Jordan and John, Gregor, Todd, Chris,
Yeah.
to me, that was just as entertaining and fun as the actual racing.
Now, with the bikes and specifically, you're talking about British bikes. The part of the racing is it that with those bikes in particular and with the ones that you own, is it that you want to make sure that the bikes still run? Is that of important to you or to have it more of an art piece or
It's sort of sad to me to see Provenance Grand Prix bikes, Formula bikes started and just revved on a stand. I think that's a little bit disappointing. It's relatively easy to do that, much harder to prepare them for any sort of actual competition. Phil Reed, multi-time, motorcycle world champion, British. He's British. He was also world champion, I think maybe 10 times, something like that. He wrote an article for Classic Bike for years, and this particular article was over 20 years ago, and he talked about this concept of reflected glory, where basically in a nutshell, he complained that the owners of his old bikes, his old world championship machines, would put their fat asses on these bikes of his and putt around on them and really do a disservice to the bikes. And his point was, you should pay me, Phil Reed. I've still got enough of what I had then in the 60s and 70s to do a better job demonstrating the bike. Yeah, I'm paraphrasing a lot here,
hmm
but
hmm
that was his point, and I really
Yeah.
appreciated that. I think you do owe it to the machines to be good enough to parade them in a fashion that demonstrates the bike's capabilities. And if you're not, you should put someone on the machine, particularly a provenance bike.
hmm
Any old bike you build or throw together, that's a different story. But if you've got a bike that did battle in the day, you should do what you can to represent the bike well either. And if it's beyond your capabilities, you should have someone that can demonstrate the bike in a way that best represents it.
Now, do you mostly collect British bikes or where does all these, if we're going to assume you have 175 vehicles, let's say at least half of them are bikes. So,
Yeah, and half of those, it's really Nortons. Like
okay.
I like Nortons. And that's everything from, you know, the early overhead cam singles to the pushrod twins to the rotary bikes of the 80s and early 90s. That's where it cuts off. I'm not into the current iteration of Norton. But 25 years or so ago now, almost 25 years, I was in Manhattan. I was kind of starving for something mechanical to futz around with. I was kind of like, I want to get an old motorcycle. I kind of said, oh, I want to get something that's, got some gravitas to it. And so I settled on British twins. Like, okay, Triumph, BSA, or Norton, something I couldn't afford a Vincent. And so, I did a lot of research. And I had a conversation with Randy Baxter of Baxter Cycles. He's out in the Midwest, and he had an oil and frame Triumph or BSA from the early 70s. Not the high water mark of Triumph or BSA, but it was, looked like a complete bike. And we're having a conversation. And he said, what do you want to do with this? And I said, I want a bike I can use that I can wrench on and improve over time, but I want a good one. He said, well, you should start with the best. Just get a Norton Commando. And I was like. So then I went down the Norton Commando rabbit hole and got a bike, a complete pile on eBay in 2000, yeah, around 2000. And I was parking it well, the day it was delivered, this was on May 11th, because I was in the middle of a breakup with a long-term girlfriend. And she had just gotten back from a trip to Paris with her sisters. And so she was extra in my shit, so to speak. And I was having this Norton Commando delivered in a crate that day from Pennsylvania. And I unboxed it on the street on 48th Street in Manhattan. And I'm on the phone with her, and I'm like, and then we ended up breaking up over that motorcycle. And I remember trying to push it into the service elevator because I was going to take it up to my apartment and basically rebuild the bike there. And I'd never seen the landlord to that point. And then he's just looking at me like, well, what do you think you're doing? And so I'm taking this motorcycle up to my apartment. He's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. And so he gives me the name of a commercial garage around the corner. And I go there. And for about a year on the weekends, I would futz around with this Norton. I never really got it to run well. And then there was a classic bike article about Team Incomplete.
Oh.
So this is 01, 02 at this point. And I thought, man, this is what I want to do. This is what I want. I didn't even really know what I wanted to do with the motorcycle with Norton, but I'm like, these cats have got to figure it out. I'm gonna Rising Wolf Garage. I'm gonna go down there, and I want to be part of that scene. Like, these are cool people. They're doing cool stuff. So I did. I met Michael Wernick, Rising Wolf. The first person I met was Jordan, and then Kenny shortly after. And Jordan at the time was riding a Norton Atlas that he had restored, and he had just gotten a Buell Firebolt XB12, I believe it was. And Jordan, those two bikes were gone fairly quickly for something bigger and better. And but Kenny, because Kenny was just starting to build his first race bike at the time, and my spot was across from Kenny's, and he saw me struggling with this Commando, and so he kind of took me under his wing, and we sort of fixed some really, really messed up, things about this bike. And then the deeper I went into Nortons, I sort of fell in love with the brand ethos of Norton motorcycles. James Norton, I want to say he got the first patent on desmodromic valve actuation in the 20s, something like that. So this guy he set the tone for the company that was one of high integrity of both dealings and engineering. And I really sort of appreciated that. When I went to college, I started out as a mechanical engineer, ended up switching to economics, but I knew enough about engineering to view the Norton Commando as the superior bike of that late 60s and early 70s era. And I still believe that to this day. I don't think I could ever be convinced otherwise. And so that sort of started the Norton fascination. And then once you start pulling on that thread, all kinds of other bikes start to come into the picture at that point. Laverdas, Vincents, Triumphs, BSAs, Yamahas, Hondas, you name it. So that's kind of, Nortons. And there's no money in Nortons. They're not Ducatis. They don't have a renaissance every 10 minutes.
Right.
There aren't thousands of photos of Steve McQueen on Norton Commandos. There are a lot of photos of Clint Eastwood on Norton Commandos. He was a big Norton fan, but not McQueen. It was sort of a way to, this is something that's not for everyone. This is kind of like, Triumphs are ubiquitous of that era, Bonnevilles, Tigers, trophies, etc. Norton to me was just a step up, a step up to something better than sort of what Triumph gave you at at that point in time. No lugged frames. The Commando is a fully welded frame. The Triumph has these heavy lugs that the tubes, go into. And I just, in the isoelastic vibration dampening of the 750 Commando and then the 850 Commando after that, just makes them insanely usable, even in modern traffic and modern speeds. You can comfortably cruise at 85 miles per hour on a well-sorted Commando, whereas on a 650 Triumph, you're going to feel it a lot more than you would. You'll be a lot more fatigued at the end of the ride than you would be on a Norton Commando. Not sure if that's
no,
this
is great. No, this is totally great. So what's the oldest motorcycle that you own?
It's actually an Indian, 1941 Indian 4-cylinder outfit. So it was sold new with the sidecar. It's original paint. I'm the third owner of the bike. I can't tell you it's a great bike to ride. It's you're waiting to hear a horse neighing in the background. This thing is about as antediluvian as it gets. But for its time, it was an extremely sophisticated motorcycle. And so that'd be the oldest one. The newest one would be like a 2019 Triumph Scrambler 1200, the Gamut.
It's a very big span there. Then that makes me wonder, in the way that you're talking about, especially the Nortons, they seem to be purchases of love versus maybe investment purchases. But how do you dabble with both sides of that, or?
Not really. I never, this is a passion for me. I don't think about whether I'm going to make money on a given motorcycle. I've obviously seen what's happened to Ducati round case twins from the 70s, even over the 25 years of my own collecting. That just, I don't know. It's just not, it's never been about money. It's been about exploring an interesting niche, of all the things that you can collect. And this just resonated to me more than Ducatis. And the people associated with Nortons just were more on my wavelength than other brands. Not to disparage any diehard people that like other brands, but it just, for me personally, there was a resonance with that brand.
And besides the brand, I also know that you have also supported custom builders as well. And maybe you can speak a little bit about what bikes you've purchased from, let's say, the smaller guy.
Smaller guy. Yeah. You mean Chris? Is that what you mean?
Well,
the smaller manufacturer. Chris.
Yes. Yeah. That's even more funny.
Chris obviously is a good friend, and he is a.
Let me just put in here, he was episode 2 on Ferros for anybody.
Yes, that was
Chris
great.
Cosentino. Yep.
That was a great interview. Chris is. People call him a mad scientist. He's not a mad. He's energetic and passionate and has strong opinions that are well earned in his craft. And watching him develop that funny front end Hossack style Tony Foal type motorcycle suspension system, and the frustrations and the achievement that he went through adapting the Ductax Rotax Ducati hybrid, and then do a clean sheet single cylinder, and now to the Ducati based single cylinder hypermono, as he calls it, bike, has really just been an amazing thing to watch. I've been a customer of Chris's for a number of years, in terms of both, engaging him on difficult engineering projects that related to motorcycles and to cars, and then as a customer for his current series of hypermono machines. And we're garage mates. Yeah. We're garage mates. Okay. We've been in the same garage across multiple garages for 18 years now or so. Yeah, 0506.
So are you going to purchase one of the race bikes from him, or one of the street versions? Or you are purchasing? Or both?
I have already purchased one, and I think I will probably, the one that really engaged me would basically be a naked version of the bike. Okay. That really highlights the engineering behind why they are doing these bikes. I think is, when you see the bike in his most recent video, he sort of highlights the naked version of the bike. And I think if that were a street bike, sort of a modern interpretation of a cafe bike, it would be just dynamite to ride and to look at.
Who else have you purchased from?
I've done 3 bikes with Walt Siegel, and Walt. I've known Walt since the earliest days of my racing, when Kenny and I were going to tracks. Walt was working in a dingy basement in, I think, Long Island City, maybe, like with standing water and stuff on the bottom. But he'd rock up on his 916 or in his Alfa Romeo GTV, and it'd be like, who the hell is this guy? I mean, he's like a movie star, but, very humble, the sweetest guy you're ever going to meet. And his approach to design, I just find to be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's curated, it's minimalist, but it's also very detail and finer point oriented. So we've done a Leggero Ducati based bike. We've all three bikes have been, well, two of the three bikes have been Ducati based, a Leggero and an adventure bike. And then the most recent one was an MV Agusta triple. And, just the only thing I can say about Walt's bikes, it's not the kind of thing you're ever going to ride all the time. And I mean that in the same way that, like an exquisite meal, you want to be in the right mood so that you could enjoy it for what it is. And, these are extremely purposeful machines that he's made. The adventure bike, less so, but particularly the MV Triple and the Ducati based Leggero. The adventure bike, I did a 1,500-mile trip with Gregor shortly after commissioning that bike. And I want to say it performed better than any other bike. It had no major issues right out of the box. And if you look at Ducatis at the Desert X, that they have out now, you can really see the lineage, or I have no idea if they, took liberties with some of Walt's design cues, but, and I think, Walt's bike, adventure bike, is really a sort of a modern interpretation of an Elephant. So there's nothing new under the sun, all that. But his stuff is expensive, but there's the old saying, price is what you pay, value is what you get. And it's easy to see why his stuff is expensive. Once you visit him, see how he makes the bikes, spend time around Walt and his family. So, I'm a big fan of both Walt and Chris.
Is there any bike that you don't currently own that you're, it's the prize?
Not really. Not really. Trying to think if there is one that I'm interested in. It's coming up for auction soon, so I don't really probably shouldn't talk too much about it. But I would be interested in that particular bike, and it's a works type race bike. As I'm doing less racing these days, I'm not actively really looking for anything.
Are you taking more day trips or weekend trips and riding on the road?
I'm not ashamed to admit that the bikes I've been riding the most of late have been a 77 Harley Davidson XLCR, their version of a cafe race bike from the late 70s. And in every way, it is a terrible motorcycle. I can't, our mutual friends suggested I dump it in the garbage, something to that effect. It has no real redeeming qualities, except as a statement, it's a beautiful thing to look at. And as you ride it, eventually all of the things wrong with it sort of melt away, and you start making excuses for it. I imagine I don't own any Jaguars or Triumph cars, but I imagine the owners of those cars look at it the same way. You develop a very sympathetic relationship with the vehicle, like a dog. This thing needs me, unlike a cat. Cats don't need anybody. So I think there's a lot of that. And so you feel like you're going to save this thing. You're going to exercise it, take it out in the world. And the other one is a 1983 Harley Davidson Electric Glide shovelhead. It is a gigantic, it's two-tone beige, which is an interesting, it's sort of like a cream beige and a light beige, and it has a brown seat, and it has the tour pack, the big trunk, the hard bags, and it's the heaviest. I'm not a small guy, but I mean, just moving this bike around in the garage, it's like, man, this thing, I can easily see, dropping this bike, just kind of moving it around. The handlebars are rubber mounted, which is odd when you push on the bike and there's that sort of delay and wishy-washiness in the controls. But as a touring bike for strictly highway use, it really eats up the miles. It's
Hmm.
very long-legged, sounds great. I think it looks great, even though it's just beige and brown everywhere, 50 shades of beige, whatever you want to call it. But
It's
yeah, those
error
are the two
correct.
yeah, it's error correct. It's
Yeah.
error correct.
On some of these older bikes, do you keep them in original shape or will you do new paint jobs on them and try to make them more modern with aftermarket parts?
I sort of I don't like jewelry box machines. I don't like, polishing stuff to an inch of its life. I much prefer, whether motorcycles or cars, to have stuff that's original to the extent it can be kept original. And that
Hmm.
includes paint, even if it's an older repaint. My threshold for repainting a car or a motorcycle is very, very high. I just, the more nicks and scratches, the more liberties you can take, the more you can use them without worrying, the more you can park them. It's the Corvette hobby is not really bad about this. There are people that show their cars, they will restore them and never put fluids in them. And they just get rolled on and off trailers onto show fields. It's a bit like the classic, gun collecting. People that collect guns never fire them, or
Hmm.
many of them don't fire them. And some of them,
Yeah.
it would be sacrilegious to fire this old weapon. And I think that's a very sad fate for a lot of cars and motorcycles. And so if something's very, kind of weathered, it's a lot easier to see where the vehicle has been over the course of its life than to see just another restored vehicle that's a different color than the one you saw at
Hmm.
the show the weekend prior. So
Yeah. I have noticed that through social media that a lot of your cars, I would say, almost have a rustic look to them, or perhaps the ones
yeah,
I've just seen, that you've
y-
shown lately.
yeah. I mean, it's certainly the older I've gotten, the more the more weathered I've become. Uh, the more I look for, I want to match the vehicle sometimes, and that extends. I don't have outfits that I wear with particular motorcycles or cars, but I kind of do at the same time. There are certain helmets that go with certain bikes. There are certain
Hmm.
jackets that go with certain bikes. There are certain shirts and sunglasses that go with certain cars. I mean, I hate when there's a dramatic or a jarring juxtaposition between the person using the machine and the machine itself. But that's just one of my own personal eccentricities.
I actually find that quite beautiful.
I do
And
as well.
suiting. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a cool thing. How do you keep up on the maintenance on everything?
I do what I can myself. I've also got, there's a network of very good, quality people in the hobby, both for cars and for motorcycles. I rely on Kenny at NYC Norton a lot. It's sort of very convenient that we share the same garage. So in terms of race bike preparation, I found that I was much faster and a much better racer once I stopped building my own bikes and
Mhm.
maintaining them, because all I could think about when I was on the track was, "Hmm, did I safety wire that? Uh, what noise is that? What noise am I hearing? And so, Kenny's a professional, and there are other professionals, car preparation as well. Next door to my garage is a very good young guy. He's probably 40, does great work. He races himself, so he brings a standard of preparation to the cars that is adds to the safety and the enjoyment, because
Mhm.
you're just worried about less.
It's a lot to take care of on top of also going to work and having a family and
Yes. Yeah.
everything that comes with life.
Yeah. I found it at Barber one year on the same bike. The following year, I got slower with each child.
Hmm.
It was just, I wasn't quite as focused on racing. I also probably got fatter, or it's a little known fact that these bikes and cars they actually shrink over the years, right?
I know
And
it's crazy.
crazy how that happens.
Yeah,
Um,
every year.
every year. But yeah, it's really just a network of people that you develop relationships with over time that kind of you have to rely on. The more burdened you become by the collection, the more you have to farm stuff out.
And it's good that you recognize that because a lot of people don't. And then a lot of their things don't ever work.
I am not one to cast stones because
Yeah.
I've got a lot of shit that don't work right now, but
Yeah, yeah.
you try to maintain a certain acceptable percentage of things that you could get on or get in within a few hours, and it would be, safe to use.
You know a lot of people within the industry, both motorcycles and cars. And in addition to the vehicles, you've also been involved in some businesses over time. Would you be open to talking a little bit about that?
Sure. I am a partner in Revit Sport USA. So this is the US side of Revit Sport International. Revit engineered skin, full line of men's and women's apparel, virtually every piece of garment and safety equipment that the motorcyclist would ever need. All the gear, all the time. Revit can supply you basically everything you need except the helmet. And, someday, maybe Revit will be in the helmet business. I don't know. But that really started out of, I used the product when our mutual friend Jordan was the U.S. representative and a partner at Revit in the mid aughts. Is that how you'd say it? I'm not sure I've ever
Yeah.
said aughts in my life.
It was
I've heard
probably
people
like
say it.
2003, I
Something,
would
yeah, in
say.
that in
Yeah,
that
somewhere
time
around
frame.
there. Yeah.
And then, the financial crisis came, 08, 09, and there was an opportunity to make an investment in Revit. I liked the product already. I liked the ethos of the brand, the principles they stood for. The founder, to this day, still runs the company, Ivan. Um, and I like the Dutch mentality that they took to running a business. It was kind of the thing that I appreciated in my day-to-day life as an investor. And that, here we are, 15 years or so later, the company has grown a lot. The product has grown a lot in function, quality, design. I'm of course very partial, but if I'm on a bike, I'm generally speaking going to be geared well and, wearing Revit.
Are there any other companies that you're involved with?
Not really in motorcycling. Yeah, not really, not in motorcycling. Other than I'm a customer of the Hypermono project
Mhm.
of Cosentino Engineering, but that's the extent of the motorcycle related investing.
As far as when you first got into motorcycling and into now, what have you seen as like the biggest change with social media influence or just how motorcycling has evolved in the US?
Yeah, I mean, when I was sort of starting vintage racing and kind of starting collecting, it was sort of in that Discovery Channel, Motorcycle Mania, Jesse James, Tuttles, that's sort of the start of well-made, initially well-made, high production value, Indian Larry, programs, and then the biker build-offs and all that stuff that came later. And that coincided with a significant jump in motorcycle sales. I think it was 1970 or so is when we started tracking new bike sales in the US. It was about a 1.1 million or so. And it basically started the decline from there every year, pretty much like clockwork until the early 2000s. And then you had sort of this renaissance, baby boomers deciding to finally get that Harley or to finally get that Honda, whatever. And sales started to pick up. That kind of coincided with, me starting to really become passionate about motorcycles. I think in the US sales peaked around a million bikes again in '05, '06, '07, somewhere in that time frame. Now they're about 550,000. They've never really recovered from the financial crisis. There was a blip during COVID where they sort of started to come back, but then things have kind of settled out again in a sort of a disappointing place. What used to be, sort of film and television 20, 25 years ago, it's now just a tremendous amount of online content, right? That's
Hmm.
related to cars and bikes. There's tremendous democratization of content, of the act of providing or creating content. It's been an amazing thing to watch. It's also overwhelming at times because the internet doesn't do a good job of filtering good stuff from bad stuff, right? And
Right.
so across every aspect of content on the internet, that's not the thrust of the internet or social media. I mean, everyone has a voice, no matter how important or knowledgeable or experienced or accomplished. They've got the same voice as your latest person that woke up one day and decided, I'm going to become an influencer. One of my 13-year-old, I asked the other day, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she said an influencer. And I kind of gagged a little bit in my mouth. because I'm like, oh God, between here and being a good influencer, like I should say you should talk to Anik. She'll tell you what you need to do between now and actually having an opinion that people should listen to. So
Thank you.
yeah, my pleasure. And I participate on Instagram as at my garage, not to throw that out there, but to me, it's really a bit of a game to figure out what content gets a response and what doesn't. And quality of posts of information is part of it. The most reaction I've ever gotten to a post was the ugliest Corvette you can imagine backing out of a transporter. It's gold and brown. It has a Monza front end on it, and it has a station wagon back end on it. This thing is a Minga in just it's so ugly that it's interesting. It's
Hmm.
ugly to the point of being interesting, and just people went ape shit over this thing. Mostly good comments, but even some very entertaining negative comments about this thing, and over 1 million views. Um, and I just like, I guess that's, I won't say it was the best commentary on society that I observed in watching this thing sort of unfold, but I find Instagram in particular to just be a fascinating place to go, when I need to veg. Obviously it's very such a schizophrenic place to be,
Yeah.
but between really good stuff and really bad stuff, and watching really good people struggle to figure out how to get an audience that helps pay for them doing more good stuff. Whereas you see a lot of it these days, people will throw out disinformation just because they know it will engender a violent response and therefore
Hmm.
eyeballs, so interesting place.
Have you found it to affect the prices of bikes?
You know, I probably yes. People throw around words like iconic or legendary or storied way too much. Like
Hmm.
without really knowing what they're talking about. Things like that. The lionization of this is not going to be a particularly popular opinion, but the lionization of the 750 SS Ducati, an amazing machine. I don't own any round case 750 SSs. I do own a square case 900 SS. I have an early Mike Halewood replica 900 SS or 900 as well. They're great machines to ride, but the cult that has formed around the 750 SS and the fly in the Imola race bike gas tank in the fiberglass, the use of color, which was really a pragmatic choice on Ducati's part because that's the color they could kind of get their hands on. I've never seen a brand do more with relatively less in terms of racing successes. The win at Imola in 1972, Paul Smart. What gets left out is the fact that Agostini was leading the race on an MV 750, a very street bike, very much a street bike with a shaft drive that ended up
Mm.
failing, and then Ducati swept to a 1-2 victory. Halewood's win a few years later at the TT on a fairly standard machine, a real testament to Halewood's capabilities as a many-time winner on the Isle of Man mountain circuit. That kind of watching that fog of, or that the way certain machines like the 750 SS have become, again, I hate to say it, but iconic, has been an interesting thing to watch, while bikes like Laverda SFCs or Norton Commando production racers sort of get lost in the discussion, even though they are at least equal to and in many ways better than the 400 or so 750 round case SS Ducatis of 1974 or so. So that's an interesting thing to watch, and I think that is largely, as you say, a function of sort of partly because Ducati is still a brand today, right?
Hmm.
That can't
Yep.
be overlooked in terms of new customers that are affluent. It can go back to the history of the brand, but I think a lot of it has to do as well with the influence of auction houses and social media and tastemakers, for lack of a better term.
That's actually an excellent term to use. For sure, especially as you said on these social media platforms, because they're allowing their opinion to resonate loudly.
Yeah, very, very loudly at times. Yeah. Yeah.
As we wrap up here, is there anything that you would like to talk about?
Um, let's see. No, I'm no, can't really think of anything that's top of mind. I'm lamenting the unavoidable approach of winter. I wish there were more
Right?
riding days left, but other than that, no, I'm trying to think about what might work for a springtime ride
That sounds
of
great.
greater consequence than just, an hour or two from
Yeah,
home.
make it the North Star, something to look forward to through winter.
Exactly. Get me through winter. Yeah.
Yeah, as
Yeah.
we do the bike maintenance that needs to happen and the car maintenance that we
Exactly.
have time for.
Exactly.
Jamie, thank you so much for coming here today and being able to talk. It's been great.
Anytime, Anik, that was fun.
Excellent. And to everybody else, ride smart. Ciao.